Go on.
It's recording.
Start from the beginning.
No, it was already on. Whatever.
In any event, where was I?
Stargate.
That's right. That's right.
Yes. Got a big pasta.
There is actually that's actually meant to be an insult. In Ezekiel, God is saying, "You are of uncertain birth. You trace your ancestry back to Abraham and Sarah, but your father was an Amorite and your mother was a Hittite. You are of the Canaanites. By the way, that's the enemy. Okay, that's the bad guys. And God says that is where you get your ancestry from." You might also look at this and go, what a patriarchal text type. Honestly. Or is God putting his blame on the people when they simply did what naturally came to them? You could even look at this and say it's an exercise in pedophilia because God sees a baby and cares for it until it becomes the right age for marriage. Well, let's try to have a look at chapter 16 from a 6th century BC viewpoint. See, in those days it was common for men to marry a young girl many years younger because the guys had to work, had to have, a household to be able to support a wife, and it was very common for girls to marry at 12 or 13 and then to have children by 14 or 15, 16 at the very oldest. Pay attention, girls. This is 2,500 years ago, I know, but let that sink in. And when the subject of prostitution comes up, which it does later on in the chapter, that's a very, very touchy subject for God because part of the worship of the false gods involved temple prostitution. How did that work? I remember thinking, how on earth do you mix those two together? The idea was that if for the rains to come, for the flowers to grow, for the crops to grow, you needed to have sacred sex with a temple priestess or whatever in the temple. That's just how you worshipped Baal or an Asherah. And so the Israelites went, that's interesting, rather than, no, not us. And so in chapter 16 we have the picture of the baby girl completely unloved, left to die. Not even the most basic care was taken of this child. Not even her cord was cut. Okay? Now, 5 kids, every one of them, the cord is cut within minutes of birth. That's just the way it is. And in the 6th century BC, it was actually no different. And if you've got bloody bits stuck to a baby, that's easy infection, easy problems, and in that time that's a death sentence. The child is abandoned and actually left out in the field completely unprotected. This child will die very soon. This child will not live a day at this rate. And God sees her. God sees her and says, live. That gives her life. It appears that God simply leaves her and then comes back later on. But in fact, let's think about it. Look at verse 7 with me. God made her grow. God was involved in her development from a baby until she was of marriageable age. That shows constant care. God doesn't say, live and grow, and then come back in 12 years and say, whoa, she's all right. No, daily God is caring, moment by moment, for this girl. And then he sees her growing, and one day he decides that she is ready. She's ready for love, but she's naked. She's vulnerable to the predations of men of low character. And God covers her nakedness and marries her. God takes intimate care of Israel. He gives everything to her, everything. He gives her beauty in the way that she grew. He adorns her with costly garments, jewellery, spices and perfumes. These are the bride gifts of the fabulously wealthy. This is where the story should end. She becomes a queen. End of story. That's the way it's supposed to be. It's rags to riches. You know, a baby left to die becomes the queen. But it doesn't, unfortunately, stop there. Have a look with me at chapter 16, verse 15. But you trusted in your beauty and used your fame to become a prostitute. You lavished your favours on anyone who passed by, and your beauty became his. You took some of your garments to make gaudy high places where you carried on your prostitution. Such things should not happen, nor should they ever occur. You also took the fine jewellery I gave you, the jewellery made of my gold and silver, and you made for yourself male idols and engaged in prostitution with them. And you took your embroidered clothes to put on them, and you offered my oil and incense before them. Also the food I provided for you, the fine flour, olive oil and honey I gave you to eat, you offered them as fragrant incense before them. That is what happened, declares Sovereign Yahweh. And you took your sons and daughters whom you bore to me and sacrificed them as foods for the idols. Was your prostitution not enough? You slaughtered my children and sacrificed them to the idols. In all your detestable practices and your prostitution, you did not remember the days of your youth, when you were naked and bare, kicking about in your own blood. Woe, woe to you, declares the Sovereign Lord. In addition to all your other wickedness, you built a mound for yourself and made a lofty shrine in every public square. At the head of every street you built your lofty shrines and degraded your beauty, offering your body with increasing promiscuity to anyone who passed by. You engaged in prostitution with the Egyptians, your lustful neighbours, and provoked me to anger with your increasing promiscuity. So I stretched out my hand against you and reduced your territory. I gave you over to the greed of your enemies, the daughters of the Philistines, who were shocked by your lewd conduct. You engaged in prostitution with the Assyrians too, because you were insatiable, and even after that you still were not satisfied. Then you increased your promiscuity to include Babylonia, a land of merchants, but even with this you were not satisfied. How weak-willed you are, declares Sovereign Yahweh, when you do all these things, acting like a brazen prostitute. When you built your mounds at the head of every street and made your lofty shrines in every public square, you were unlike a prostitute because you scorned payment. You adulterous wife, you prefer strangers to your own husband. Every prostitute receives a fee, but you give gifts to all your lovers, bribing them to come to you from everywhere for your illicit favours. So in your prostitution you are the opposite of others. No one runs after you for your favours. You are the very opposite, for you give payment, and none is given to you. Israel is not satisfied. This is like the stories of the old rich men who marry young women who are pretty. The pretty young women take the money and go off with other young men, spend their money on the young men. Now what happens in those stories? A divorce happens in those stories. The modern equivalent of this one is the young wife would set up an apartment, spend some nights there with her boyfriend while her rich husband sits at home. But the people of God have done far worse. Imagine if this young woman then went to the local bars and pubs and offered herself to any and every guy there and said, I will give you money for sleeping with me. Now that's horrific. It's terrible. In today's society, that wife would get nothing in the divorce. She'd be shown to have simply sucked all the cash out of her husband and shown no respect and get nothing. This story is meant to shock us. It's meant to upset us. Why? Because it upsets God when his people behave like that. Here's the thing. God gave everything to Israel. Everything. Everything. Food, water, housing, everything. They were wealthy, they were prosperous. When they entered the land, 12 to 1500 years before Jesus was born. They basically walked in. Their neighbours were scared of them. They virtually didn't have to lift a finger. They ate food that they didn't plant. One warrior would rout 100, and 100 men would overtake a city. But once they got in there, they got lazy. And the people would say, well, what about this God? What about Baal? I hear they have pretty cool worship services there. A lot less blood and a lot more fun. They would attribute the good rains to a demon who convinced them that illicit sex was their worship. And then over the last few weeks, we saw that they did even worse than that. They set up idols in the Holy of Holies. Now, time out for a second. In about 167 BC, there's a fellow called Antiochus IV, king of Greece, well, not really Greece, but part of the Greek Empire. And he got really angry. He was looking after Israel. He owned it, literally. And he got really angry one day because he lost a battle and he came back and found Jerusalem was in a riot because they thought he was dead. And so he walked into the Holy of Holies, set up a statue for Zeus and sacrificed a pig on the altar for God and worshipped Zeus. I'm not going to lie, that's bad. That's about as bad and about the biggest get stuffed that you'll ever hear in the history of political religious actions. It's like that is as bad as it gets. But it doesn't hold a candle to the people of God setting up Asherah poles and statues of Baal in their own temple. They knew better. Antiochus was a nutbag. He was a lunatic. And he was trying to offend the people in the most offensive way possible. He did a very good job of it. He didn't believe in Yahweh. And if he believed that someone like that existed, he only would have put him in the same category as Apollo or Zeus or Diana or those guys. They knew better. They knew they weren't supposed to make statues. They knew they weren't supposed to bow down and worship things. They knew the right way to worship God, and they ignored it. And they worshipped Baal alongside Yahweh. When they were punished by God, like he said he would, instead of repenting, instead of saying, we have been worshipping false gods, instead of saying we have offended God, they turned to the nations around them and said, what do you guys do? Because it's not working for us. God would send, the way God punished them was by sending Philistines, Assyrians, and eventually the Babylonians against them. And instead of turning to God, they turned to Egypt. They turned to other nations and said, you protect us because we can't do it ourselves. This is the people who just walked around Jericho and shouted and it fell. It went on and on and on. Now that could be the end of the story. God could just say, boom, that's it, you're gone. But he doesn't. Come with me to verse 53. What's happened between what I had read before and now was God compares them to Sodom, Genesis 15, bad place, Samaria, north part of Israel, was carried off to Assyria, bad place, wicked place, and says you made them look good by this.